Chapter 3. The trip back to Dana, the Sarah capital, was not the most pleasant. But luckily for Jaden, Harold was determined to get there as quickly as possible. They spent next to no time at rest, and kept as quick a pace as they could manage with a string of prisoners tied behind the horses. There were less than 20 prisoners, and though it was far below his station, Jaden was assigned guard duty, which was a good sign of how easy the task was. With 10 Sarah riders, Jaden basically just had to keep an eye out. The only trouble came just inside the Sarah border. 2 of the prisoners had been sharing furtive conversations half the evening, but Jaden had been listening. When they grabbed for his sword, he stepped his horse out of the way. They were 2 of the bigger Austerans, but on horseback, Jaden was taller and quicker. Before his brother could register the disturbance, Jaden leaned in, speaking quietly in Austeran. "It's not worth it. Harold and Ecrian could ride you down in seconds." The 2 men glanced at each other, and Jaden half grinned. "And holding me hostage will just get us all killed." After that, they settled down. Jaden would guess they were not giving up, but waiting for the opportunity that Dana would present. And hells, they would have plenty of chances. Most prisoners of war in Sarah were barely confined. The nobles would be ransomed, and the common fighters would be given jobs as servants, which were absurdly easy to escape from. Each war, the Sarah army brought home a few dozen prisoners, and by the end of the year, almost all were back home. A few were too cowardly to run. If they didn't make it to the border before some bored Sarah noble found them, they would probably be beaten, but many found their new lives more pleasant. Paid, usually none too hard work, housing and food provided, and just stayed. Of course, Jaden knew it was not very honorable to just submit to being held by the enemy, no matter how briefly, but for now these prisoners seemed resolved to walk calmly to Dana. Jaden made sure they were well fed and had good places to sleep at night, and mainly left his guard duty at that. He gave the other Sarah warriors as wide a berth as their small company would allow. He had no problem with Sergeant Ecrian. The man had taught both princes how to fight, and had never been cruel. But the messenger was a boy 6 years younger than Jaden, and desperate to prove himself. The best way he had was by showing his absolute disdain for the pansy of a prince. When William deigned to look at him, it was exclusively to make snide jokes, and Harold was Harold, quietly disdainful and easily annoyed. So Jaden watched the prisoners and stayed out of everyone else's way. They reached Karn, the first city within the current borders, in time to claim rooms in the fort for the night. It was only 4 nights since they left the army, but with the week waiting for the Austeran army and the hard march before that, Jaden was more than happy for the prospect of a bed in a warm room. And he refused to be embarrassed about it. Both Harold and William were in equally high spirits as they rode into town. Of course, from what Jaden could hear, their good mood had less to do with beds and more to do with having girls to fill them. As soon as they reached the fort, Harold, William, and the others headed off to the banquet, already flirting with the maid who had been sent to guide them, but Jaden stopped in the courtyard looking around. A page stepped out of the shadows, coming forward to take the prisoner's lead chain from Jaden. "Have fun settling the prisoners, Your Grace," the messenger called out as he passed. "Just don't get too distracted by the sweet little page boy." Jaden rolled his eyes. It was a weak insult. What annoyed him was the look of nervous disgust the page was now giving him. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 years old, but clearly knew the rumors as well as anyone else. Jaden took the chain back out of the page's hand and cleared his throat. "I know the way." There were cells in the lowest level of the keep, really little more than closets with cots and barred doors, but enough to offer the prisoners privacy and keep them from escaping quite yet. "I can take care of this myself. You're dismissed." The page stepped back, pulling his hand away, as if the prince were contagious, and ran off more quickly than polite. It had been years since Jaden had been here, but the path was easy to follow. He found the cells with the guards already waiting, and when they made no move to help, took the keys from them. Jaden unlocked each prisoner from the line and held the door for them before locking it behind them. The last in line looked down at him as he stood with the cell door wide open. The tall Tamarin watched him curiously, not moving. Jaden was just opening his mouth to tell the man to move when he finally spoke, in precise Sarah. Which was not that unexpected. Almost everyone on the continent spoke at least some Sarah. "Your nobility." The comment seemed so out of the blue that for a moment Jaden had no idea what to say. He shrugged. "Well, yes." Why do you let them treat you like that? A wave of shame rushed through him, but he didn't have an answer. He clamped his lips together and plastered his habitual smile across his face. After a moment, the tall man, really more of a boy, grinned back. Jaden was suddenly uncomfortably aware of how close he was. Jaden had made sure that all the prisoners had at least a thick cloak, but the tavern was still shirtless and had the cloak thrown back over his shoulders. He smelled surprisingly not bad, certainly a little musky, but with a deeper undertones of summer and cottonwood trees. Jaden wanted to lean in, but forced himself to step back until he hit the wall. The doorway was narrow. It didn't give him much room. Jaden cleared his throat. "What's your name?" The boy's grin grew. "Kiyto. And you?" "Jaden." The boy's eyebrows shot up. Had he really not known who Jaden was? At least Jaden was now sure who the prisoner was. That name was unquestionably Tamron. In the silence, Jaden heard the guards chatting at the other end of the hall. "Now that tall girl, I could sink my teeth into her, if you know what I mean." The other guard laughed, and Jaden watched the Tamron's eyes track to the guards. Don't worry about your sister," Jaden offered, loudly, letting his voice travel down the hall. "She's Harold's prisoner. He would never tolerate anyone touching something that's his." The guards fell silent, getting the message. "And what about Prince Harold himself?" The Tamron kept his voice low, and Jaden had no question as to why. "Harold has never had any need to take a girl against her will." The boy raised an eyebrow, and Jaden shook his head. "He's an honorable man. You have no need for concern." Strangely, the boy did not look relieved. He also did not look nervous, scared, angry, or any of the emotions Jaden would expect in such a situation. He looked amused. "Whatever you say," he grinned, and added a teasing, "Your Grace." Then he nodded, brushing uncomfortably close to step into his cell. He sat against the far wall, his manacled wrists held loosely in front of him, and watched Jaden. For a moment the prince just watched him back. "Don't you have a feast to get to?" the Tamron boy asked, laughingly. Jaden squeezed his eyes shut in annoyance. He had been down here far too long. With a shake of his head, he pulled the cell door shut, locking it and turning towards the upper fort. He was almost at the first flight of stairs when he heard one of the guards behind him clear his throat. Your Grace? The keys?" Half blushing, Jaden turned back, tossing the guards the keys before making his escape. Lord William was already tipsy by the time Jaden slipped into the banquet hall. Harold also had a tankard of ale in his hand, but the prince had always been the more restrained of the two. But they were both young, and had just won a battle. They would be smashed by the end of the night. "Why, if it isn't the little catamite! Did you get lost down in the dungeons?" William stood, raising his mug as if in salute. Eyes all over the room swarmed over him, and Jaden forced his face neutral. But the young lord found himself quite funny. He pressed on. "Did you find some big man to get lost with?" Jaden did not respond, and after the laughter died down, Lord William finally sat and turned back to Harold. The Crown Prince was still watching him, but Jaden let go, leaning back against the wall and bringing his hand up to rub his forehead in annoyance. William was barely tipsy, and he only got more insulting the more he drank. This was going to be a long night.